When we ask the question, what makes a hero different from a villain, the answer is usually, how much time you got? Even if we ignore the fact that their morals and goals are generally by definition diametrically opposed, it's common for everything from their visual design to their key personality quirks to be designed for maximum contrast to one another. It's David versus Goliath, it's law versus chaos, it's friendship versus solitude, it's one brave soul against an army. If one of them is small and clever, maybe the guy they're fighting is enormously strong. If one's straight-laced and uptight, the other's probably contrasting those qualities by being chaotic and free. If one's got a giant army of well-organized minions, the other's gotta make do with a tiny crew of ragtag misfits. If one comes from privilege, the other could be sporting a far more working-class angle on the world. If one's wearing jewel tones, their foe is in pastels. Irreconcilable contrasts like this help make for interesting dynamics between the protagonists and antagonists of any given tale. Wildly different life experiences lend themselves to very different perspectives that can blow up into full-blown ideological conflicts of the sort generally required for a proper battle of heroes and villainy. And on a purely mechanical level, having different strengths and weaknesses can make for much more interesting choreography than just brute force beam clashes between roughly equivalent forces. And there's a lot of benefits to having your antagonists strongly contrast the key qualities of your protagonists. For one thing, that's usually how you get narrative foils, who heighten each other's characterization through their opposition. We appreciate the strength of the really strong guy a lot more if they aren't surrounded by other really strong guys, and that really strongness is even more prominent if they're constantly spending time with an extremely unstrong character, whether that's to help them out or to fight them. And of course, it makes for a scenario where the two sides of the story have prominent foundational differences that seemingly demand to come into conflict with one another. Of course these guys are enemies. How could they ever agree on anything? I mean, really? Pastels? And that sure is a comforting framework to operate on. There's a good side where the good guys are, and then over in Oppositesville are the bad guys who have qualities that are completely different from our good guys. And that's how you know they're bad. They don't look or talk anything like us. They're all conveniently color coordinated so we don't get confused, and they hate the things we love and love the things we specifically hate. How comforting to know the enemy. How simple it is to always know exactly who we should be fighting. So what if instead we don't do that? The dark reflection is a very simple trope, arguably a lot simpler than all this other stuff we've been talking about. To create a dark reflection, simply take one of your protagonists, copy and paste, and alter them very slightly. Maybe their backstory is just a little bit more unpleasant, or their more dubious qualities are just a little more heightened. Maybe their carefree attitude has been nudged into nihilism. Maybe their passion for justice has escalated into a thirst for vengeance. Maybe they just haven't had the protagonist's positive character development yet. The dark reflection resembles the protagonist in almost every key way, but the tiny differences that remain are all it takes to flip their character archetype from unconditionally good into full-on problem territory. And that's the kind of thing that can be very alarming to a protagonist who previously thought their grip on heroism was a lot less tenuous. The more similar the heroes and the villains are, the less certain either one can be of their respective moral positions. In order to qualify as a dark reflection, a character must strongly resemble their opposing character in several key ways, usually starting with their visual design and extending deeper into their core characterization from there. A dark reflection is basically a personified what if. What if this main character had taken a slightly different turn, or gotten attached to a slightly different person, or cared just a little bit less about whatever keeps them on the straight and narrow? What if this one quality was heightened, or this other quality was suppressed? What if you looked in the mirror and one thing was different, and that was enough to change you completely? How much of you is you, and how much of you is just good luck? Practically speaking, there are a few different categories of dark reflection with their own custom parameters and rules, so let's break that down real quick. Before we get deep into the meat of it, we should touch on the one dark reflection that bypasses all that character depth I just talked about and instead takes things a lot more literally, that being the evil mirror version. In this highly specific subtrope, a character's literal actual reflection peels itself out of the nearest mirror so they can fight. Evil mirror versions can also be conjured from nightmares, summoned by bad guys, forms taken on by shapeshifters, or otherwise worn as a convenient reskin on what amounts to an extremely generic threat. Evil mirror versions are generally extremely limited in the characterization department, and any dialogue they have will basically just be voicing the protagonist's insecurities and fears. It's honestly more common for these things to not have dialogue, and just present a highly personalized threat and the exciting challenge of figuring out how to defeat yourself in combat. They're a lot of fun, but as a rule they're not that deep, so we're gonna move on to the juicy stuff now. The classic version of the dark reflection is the evil twin, a cliche so old hat it's barely a hat at all anymore. The narrative format can vary a little depending on whether or not the protagonist already knows they have have a twin or that the twin is evil, but structurally it's simple. There's someone that looks just like you, except perhaps with mildly different makeup and or facial hair, only they're evil and they'll give you a bad name by getting up to all kinds of evil shenanigans while wearing your face. While many Dark Reflections are complex and nuanced characters in their own right, the evil twin is usually somewhat limited in comparison, since their primary narrative role is based around how closely they physically resemble their non-evil counterpart, and how much confusion this can cause. Evil twins almost always at least try to impersonate their non-evil twin, the effectiveness of which is strongly dependent on the needs of the plot and how observant their friends are this week. Even when they're not doing it on purpose, the evil twin's resemblance to their non-evil version will still cause all kinds of problems, mistaken identities, and 12th Night style shenanigans. The evil twin category can also loosely cover evil mirror universes and evil inexplicable doppelgangers of all stripes, not just the specific biological siblings angle. They don't have to have been a twin to functionally and narratively qualify as an evil twin, but the actual evil twin version has the distinction of being technically possible in the real world, and therefore requiring the least suspension of disbelief to theoretically buy. As a final distinction from other Dark Reflections, an evil twin has usually lived their own full life up to this point in the story, and has very little in common with their good twin aside from their inconveniently identical appearance. In fact, the story might play up how much of a facade that identical face really is by highlighting how extremely different the twinned characters are on the inside. Sort of a classic nature versus nurture thought experiment made manifest without all the ethical violations required to try it in the real world. But on the flip side, very different from the evil twin is the evil clone, a copy of the character created through some form of mad science, usually in an explicit attempt to replicate their useful qualities in a form that a bad guy can actually control. These guys are much less common in theoretically grounded and realistic story formats because human cloning is kind of an ethical no-no and also apparently really hard, but evil clones are a dime a dozen in superhero stories and similarly fantastical settings. When a villain is faced with a hero they don't know how to deal with, all they need is a blood sample or a stray hair to grow their own convenient solution to the problem. And to be fair to the evil clones of the world, evil is kind of a misnomer here because frankly these guys very rarely stay evil for long. This is because the evil clone lends itself to a few very specific forms of highly juicy angst, where a protagonist who's lived a full and complex life full of trusted loved ones who have helped shape them into who they are is faced with a copy of themselves that was grown in a lab, usually controlled by someone who exclusively wants to use them as a weapon. This isn't just distressing for the protagonist, it's often also extremely distressing for the evil clone. In superhero settings, the evil clone is often used to lend some insight into how much of the protagonist's character is the result of the superpowers they're playing with versus how much of it is their actual individual personality, because the evil clone generally has those same superpowers, or at least a very comparable power set to play with. So, all other things being equal, what makes these two characters different from one another? This sort of exploration can also reveal how little the enemy that cloned them actually understands them, if the copy they created shares the protagonist's powers but has none of the character traits that keep letting them win. Evil clones have a whole host of fascinating personal issues and angsts to be had about being explicitly designed and purpose-built in someone else's shadow, and I just love these guys, man. Every time they decant a new girl version of Wolverine, an angel gets its wings. The most disconnected form of the Dark Reflection archetype is the evil equal. These characters don't need to have any sort of physical connection or resemblance to their counterpart. No DNA in common, no inexplicably identical appearances, not even necessarily a common origin story. The thing that defines the evil equal is their abilities. The purpose of the evil equal is to perfectly match the skill set of their counterpart and challenge them in a way they're potentially unprepared for. A mastermind protagonist suddenly has to deal with an equally brilliant mastermind antagonist working against them. A highly skilled warrior with an unusual fighting style is suddenly dealing with someone who already knows their moves. This can be very jarring and disorienting to a protagonist who's used to being the hottest game in town when it comes to their specialty, and that's what makes the evil equal such a good gut punch. The protagonist had the edge of uniqueness up to this point, guaranteeing that nobody was really fighting them on equal footing, but now they've got to figure out how to defeat themselves in a way they couldn't be expected to already know. There is one connection an evil equal might have to their counterpart. It's not uncommon for the two of them to have learned from the same teacher, potentially even at the same time. An evil equal might have started off as an evil predecessor, an evil rival, or more juicily, a non-evil ally. Perhaps the evil equal was once one half of a dynamic duo of equivalently skilled badasses, but now that one of them is split from the team, the other has become a nemesis of the highest caliber. Evil equals are also fun because they have a tendency to operate in packs. A 5-man band of protagonists might find themselves facing a 5-man band of their evil equals, with their own antagonistic versions of the leader, Lancer, Big Eye, Smart Guy, and Heart. This will almost inevitably lead to the situation where the two parties have to have a big fight. Everyone starts off doing a mirror match versus their own evil equal before they remember their trope training and all swap opponents to take advantage of their respective strengths and weaknesses to win the day. This has the fun extra benefit that the protagonists all get to cleanly work out which of their own teammates they could take in a fight without having to actually hurt any feelings about it. But all of these dark reflections are functionally still completely different people from their counterparts. They've got a lot in common with their non-evil protagonist versions, but there's still a whole other human being who just happens to have a lot in common with the good guys. Those are a lot less existentially horrifying than the last category of dark reflection, which is the highly specific and highly narratively effective evil future version. This is a character who doesn't just look like you or share the same DNA as you. This is you, just a few rough days and bad decisions away from the you are now. These guys are obviously fully fantastical and basically can't show up outside of superhero sci-fi and fantasy settings, but they're by far the most alarming form of dark reflection because they aren't just a what if, they're a what could happen next. This is a character who spent the majority of their life doing exactly what the protagonist has done, and then something happened to them and they became someone the protagonist finds horrifying, nightmarish, and worst of all, still recognizable. One of the things that makes these dark reflection archetypes so interesting is that by their very nature, they can't really work on their own. A dark reflection has to be reflecting someone. In isolation, they're just an antagonist with a perhaps above average number of sympathetic qualities baked in. It's only in their dynamic with the protagonist they're reflecting that they really get to shine. The parts of the characters that are similar or even identical help highlight the contrast of the parts of them that are so different, in a way that doesn't really work if the character is contrasted with someone who's just fully unrelated to them. There's kind of a vector addition thing going on here. Character traits that are perfectly opposed to one another interact in an interesting way by clashing as strongly as possible, and character traits that are extremely similar play into one another by heightening along the same axis. But characters that are just kind of doing different things, those qualities don't really interact with any sort of force, and instead just weakly ricochet off in a random direction rather than producing an interesting compare and contrast. Like, let's take Batman. A lot of people like to point out that most of his main villains are all sort of dark reflections of him. Two-Face mirrors his privileged upbringing marred by a very public trauma that results in dual identities, but Two-Face indulges in his erratic and overwhelming emotions rather than turning them into motivation. Scarecrow mirrors his weaponized use of fear but spreads it indiscriminately for shits and gigs. Bane mirrors how he's pushed his body to all its physical limits through extreme training but also heightens it with drugs. Ra's al Ghul mirrors his mastermind detective traits but uses them to run the League of Assassins and kill people who inconvenience him. And some writers play the angle that the Joker mirrors his profoundly tragic backstory, but let it escalate into an all-consuming nihilistic madness and chaos rather than honing it into motivation to make the world a better place where nobody suffers the same senseless tragedy again. All these points of contrast make their conflicts with Batman very interesting, because each of them can be seen as a bad ending for Bruce if he hadn't managed to turn himself into Batman instead. But if you pit these guys against any other DC superhero, you just get a normal fight. Guess what happens in Superman vs. Bane? Superman wins, and then he goes home and he never thinks about it again. Their character traits are just going in completely unrelated directions, so you don't get that juicy dark reflection, angst and introspection and the terror of where the road not taken might have led. You get a strong guy versus an infinitely stronger guy and it's over in 2 seconds flat. What makes the dark reflection so impactful is that when they confront their corresponding protagonist, it results in a whole lot of mandatory introspection. A hero who looks at a villain and sees an irreconcilable enemy who just needs to be stopped is dealing with a very simple problem compared to a character who finds themselves fighting the person they could have very easily become. And that reflective nature is symmetrical. The hero isn't just dealing with a nightmarish bad ending of who they could have become. The dark reflection is stuck looking at their own bright reflection, the hero they could have been with a little more support or love or just good luck. It's no wonder this trope gets so much traction in the character-driven angst department. One common way this gets played is for sympathy. A character who sees in this antagonist a version of who they could have become if their life were just a bit crueler to them is potentially going to relate, to understand, and to want to help. It's a textbook instance of the golden rule applying. If they see themselves in their opponent, they might decide to treat them the way they'd want to be treated in their place, with mercy and second chances and the opportunity to be better. Sometimes this is aided by the protagonist having actually kind of been where they are before, if the off-ramp that turned their dark reflection into this version of themselves is a character struggle they've actually previously overcome. A character who's experienced the pain of loss but managed to heal with support and time can potentially be a very healing influence on someone for whom the wound is extremely fresh and unresolved. In fact, this can be an opportunity for some very impactful kindness, because many people, fictional and otherwise, find it very difficult to be kind and understanding towards themselves, but may have a much easier time doing it to someone else in a situation they recognize. Someone who toughed out their own tragic backstory with relative ease might be horrified to see those same events inflicted on their dark reflection, and inclined to give them much more compassion than they ever show themselves. When a character sees their circumstances externalized on someone else, it gives them a newfound opportunity to examine those circumstances with clarity, and perhaps to give their dark reflection the guidance and kindness that they themselves were shown before. But on the flip side, it's also common for the complete opposite situation to happen. There's an interesting phenomenon both in and outside of fiction where the qualities in others we find most viscerally frustrating are often the ones we can recognize in ourselves. An unknowable, incomprehensible evil is a lot less gear-grinding than one we kind of understand. Like, if we see someone doing something we used to do but stopped because we decided it was bad or wrong, it can frustrate us a lot more than seeing a completely outside context bit of shittiness, because we're not just mad at them for doing this thing, we're also mad at ourselves for ever having been the kind of person to do the same. When a character confronts their dark reflection, the worst part is usually that they recognize themselves. They know why their dark reflection did that, and they know they should have done better. For a common fictional example, a character with an ironclad moral line they refuse to cross knows exactly how tempting it is to want to cross that line and take the easy way out just once. And if they come face to face with a version of themselves who did exactly that, they're confronting what feels like their own greatest failure, even if they personally haven't actually done anything wrong. They're seeing what would happen if they did the thing they actively choose to never do. A dark reflection confronts the protagonist with how easy it would be for them to become the worst version of themselves. Now, this is where the dark reflection narrative can start to feel a little bit weird, because if we take a character who's basically only ever done heroic stuff and then go, hey, but like, what if they decided to be evil instead? Would that be f***ed up or what? It can feel like a bit of a non-question. Like, yeah, it would be f***ed up if this thing that would never happen managed to happen, but it's not gonna, so why are we dignifying this? This is a gripe I commonly have with evil Superman stories that frame him as profoundly corruptible, where his goodness is really just a statistical fluke brought on by not having enough bad stuff happen to him yet. The thing is, Superman is practically swimming in dark reflections that avoid this problem, starting with Bizarro and escalating from there. Characters who are like Superman, but not Superman. There are tons of Kryptonians and Kryptonian equivalents with all of his powers and none of his Superman-ness, and they're less about elucidating how close he is to being evil by taking this one easy off-ramp into Villainsville instead, and more about how the thing that makes him Superman isn't the superpowers, because all these other people with those superpowers don't choose to use them to be Superman. Even given the exact same opportunities and potential, nobody else does exactly what he does. Even the ones who are superheroes don't do it the same as him. So with his powers not being responsible for his heroism, some writers instead ask if it's his upbringing that makes him a hero, presenting versions of him that didn't get raised by the Kents to see if they're the magic factor that makes him a good guy. In the current comic run of Absolute Superman, we get a version of Kal-El who gets none of the typical Clark Kent experiences, and instead suffers through a far more emotionally crushing timeline of the destruction of his planet when he's old enough to know it's happening, the loss of his Kryptonian parents and then the Kents before he gets to have any sort of life with them, and a world that is far more thankless and fraught with despair than anything he has to deal with in the main timeline blue spandex and cape situation. And yet, this Superman is still clawing his way towards becoming the paragon hero and symbol of hope that we know he will inevitably become, because that's what Superman is. That's who he chooses to be. Absolute Superman is a dark reflection of classic Superman while still being Superman, taking a far more painful route to reach the same end goal. These sorts of dark reflections don't highlight how he's one bad day away from snapping and conquering the Earth, they highlight how remarkable his goodness really is, and how inspiring he can be even to people with the exact same abilities he has. What if is a fascinating question, in large part because in the real world, trapped by the confines of linear time, what if is also unanswerable. We can never know how the story would have played out if one thing had gone a little differently, because history doesn't get do-overs. But that's why it's such an interesting avenue of exploration. What if has no right answers, but it can give us perspective and make it easier to appreciate the things that did happen. Glimpses of the roads not taken can cast the road we did take into a new light. The greatest strength of the dark reflection trope is that it provokes character analysis. It's not just that the protagonist is forced into introspection by seeing their own key qualities staring back at them, the audience is also given a fascinating opportunity to compare and contrast between two characters simultaneously very similar and different in all the ways that matter. A dark reflection in the what if that they embody transforms our perspective on a character from seeing them as a static object with a bundle of fairly consistent qualities to seeing them as a changing, growing person who could have easily taken another path and become a different character entirely. And this is a very useful illusion because it helps make characters feel more real in ways they categorically aren't. Characters aren't people, they don't make decisions, and they don't experience growth. They're written in such a way that we're encouraged to forget that, but the character does what the writer writes them doing, no more and no less. It's common for a character faced with their dark reflection to say things like, "I'll never be like you," or "You made your choice, and so did I," which really helps reinforce the illusion that the character is making choices and has control over who they become. A dark reflection is incredibly good at giving characters agency, which is a very nifty trick. And if it drops a boatload of depth and nuance onto the heroic qualities we're otherwise primed to take for granted, well, so much the better. Heroism is always more meaningful when we see it not as an unchanging fact about a person, but as a choice that can always be made. So, yeah.
And I'll take one more step away from a face I used to recognize, familiar shadows closing in, suffocating fear descends, it comes alive, uncovered.